So I've been seeing a lot of videos of people saying that Ilia Topuria, the reason why he's so good is because he has a really, really strong kinetic chain. And I think those videos are interesting and they are very, very intriguing. But I feel like they are kind of a superficial way of looking at combat sports because the number one thing that separates the best fighters versus the great fighters is the fact that positioning and decision making are the biggest factors between those two types of competitors, the best decision makers versus fighters that are just in there mindlessly fighting and doing things, without any merit or any system behind them. The reason why Ilia Topuria, in my opinion, is so good is because he has elite decision making. In this clip that we're going to see here, Ilia Topuria absolutely dominates Oliveira in the positioning. I think that those videos of people talking about Topuria and his kinetic chain are very interesting, but they are very superficial in the sense that Ilia Topuria has very, very strong strikes, but he needs to get in position first to land those strikes. And I think that that's the difference. In combat sports, especially in the top three contenders, number one contenders and champions, everybody could land. Everybody is powerful. Everybody's quick. Everybody's fast. Everybody has the IQ to get them to those positions in the rankings, but the main thing that separates them all is decision making. That's why a champion is a champion. A number one contender is a number one contender, and then everybody else follows through behind those. So let's go ahead and break this down even further. I think that this is a very, very important video, especially for those of you guys that want to know ball, actually. So in this exchange, Mark Goddard gets him back up off the feet because Charles Oliveira was just laying on his back doing absolutely nothing, and he didn't want to engage, and Ilia Topuria was just confused. So they get back into the 50-50. In this, this is a very, very smart and savvy position that Ilia Topuria is going to make against Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira is fighting with a high guard, and you would think that Charles Oliveira, having the length advantage, would try to put something here in the middle, to try to get Ilia Topuria at bay, but he doesn't. Charles Oliveira is fighting with a very, very high guard, which a lot of people say that, have your hands up, that's the number one defense. But before that, you should really try to make sure that your opponent, has some sort of level of threat, especially a defensive threat, which doesn't always have to be offense, in between you guys. And that's something that Charles Oliveira just really doesn't do. So what does Ilia Topuria do in this situation? He gets ready to attack, and then he controls Charles Oliveira's rear hand. He literally grabs his rear hand and forces a 50-50 exchange with Charles Oliveira and lands. That's the difference between these two fighters, is the night and day of IQ in terms of the striking. We were gonna say that, his kinetic chain here, his right hand is so quick, is so big and powerful that he's able to explode. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but he has to get in position first, right? In position first to land that strike. And right here, the position that Ilia Topuria is going for is a very standard control. He is controlling Charles Oliveira's rear hand, right, to make sure it stays there in the guard, like a lot of people like to say, hands up. That's the main sort of defense that you should be going for in combat sports fight, right? But Ilia Topuria is using that against Charles Oliveira. He's controlling his rear hand and goes for an easy overhand. I'm talking about like easy overhand. This is something that it looks like I do to my little brother, like no bullshit. And I think that that's just pretty straightforward stuff. And then, of course, while Ilia Topuria is inside the 50-50, being the shorter fighter, being at range, of course, he's going to try to follow up with some shots, right? And then goes for a clinch with Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira does a smart thing, trying to get really, really physical with Ilia Topuria, being a really, really good grappler. And here is a very, very good position from Charles Oliveira as well, having the underhooks on Ilia Topuria on one arm and then going for knees and then trying his best to pressure Ilia Topuria towards the fence, which Ilia Topuria then recognizes and tries to break that clinch as fast as possible, which is a smart thing for Ilia Topuria to do because he doesn't really want to get in a clinch exchange with a taller guy that has obviously the knees advantage, especially walking backwards, right? You never want to be in that position. So Ilia Topuria does a smart thing, breaks that disengagement, right? A lot of people say that, oh, you should really just press forward the entire time in a fight. You should never look for a disengagement. You should always be trying to pressure. That's not something that Ilia Topuria does. Ilia Topuria knows when to pressure. He knows when to disengage. He knows what he wants to do. And something that we always know about Ilia Topuria is that he wants to take the center of the octagon. That's where he has most of his macro success, is fighting from the center. And we're going to see here how Ilia Topuria is able to get back towards the center of the octagon. And we know that because that's where he wants to go. We're going to see Ilia Topuria move from this side of the cage to this side of the cage to get back into the center. And it's a very, very smart thing that Ilia Topuria does here. And it's very standard. You guys are going to be absolutely impressed by this. So we see here Charles Oliveira, low IQ striking, in my opinion. Again, fighting with a very, very high guard. He has all this space to work behind him. And he's trying to pressure Ilia Topuria into the cage. Ilia Topuria is recognizing this. That's why he is throwing a feint, forcing Charles Oliveira to stay defensively responsible, right, guys? We need to have our hands up. That's what everybody says, right? We have to have our hands up. Ilia Topuria recognizes this. So he's forcing Charles Oliveira to stay defensively responsible. And in doing so, it gives him enough time to think and decide. Boom! Lands a jab. Just by getting Charles Oliveira to bite into a feint. And of course, Charles Oliveira, he takes that shot. And he's going to immediately try to counter. Granted, very, very good positioning here from Charles Oliveira. Realizes that Ilia Topuria is moving backwards. Ilia Topuria here should have been going for a high guard, going for a full disengagement. But it's okay. They land punches. We see Charles Oliveira here try to pressure as well. Ilia Topuria is doing the smart thing. What did we just see Ilia Topuria do prior to this? Go for a clinch. But he doesn't do that here. He goes for a very, very standard disengagement. And this is the beginning of the end, because when Ilia Topuria finds himself back into the center of the octagon, like I said multiple times, ladies and gentlemen, this is where Ilia Topuria has his most success throwing macro in the octagon. But what do I mean by macro? Macro is positioning where you are in the octagon. And Ilia Topuria is very, very good at having offensive schemes through his macro movement. So, again, we see here Charles Oliveira, very, very high guard, trying to stay very defensively responsible. Hands up, ladies and gentlemen, right? That's what we all hear all the time. Like, oh, have to have our hands up in the 50-50 exchange. So we see here, right? Charles Oliveira has a very defensive posture. Like, oh, I'm not going to let Ilia Topuria hit me. Ilia does a very, very interesting thing here. He goes for a disengagement. This is right here a perfect example of a bait. A perfect example of a bait. I want you guys to pay attention to this because this is very high level IQ stuff. Ilia Topuria here goes for a disengagement, and he's waiting for Charles Oliveira to follow. How do we know that? How do we know that he's waiting for Charles Oliveira to follow? Because he goes for a base break. This is, screenshot this, ladies and gentlemen. This is a perfect example of how to break your opponent's base. Charles Oliveira here is about to break his base. And we're going to see it. Like literally right now, we're about to see Charles Oliveira break his base. You saw how Charles Oliveira has a high guard right here? Boom! His hands drop. No longer in that defensive stance. Charles Oliveira has to gather his base is all over the place. He's standing square as fuck right now. Charles Oliveira literally has to bring his foot back in front. That's wasted time. Wasted time that Charles Oliveira could have been using to take a disengagement. But what does Charles Oliveira do here? Charles Oliveira, with his base broken, decides to challenge Ilia Topuria into a 50-50 exchange. This is the perfect example of forcing an ego challenge. Charles Oliveira had all the time. He had 10 years, literally 10 freaking years to go for a disengagement. But he doesn't. He doesn't. And Ilia Topuria here is able to bait Charles Oliveira into becoming offensive. And he's going to go for a quick flip into Charles Oliveira's chest, well, it's not the perfect example of digging into somebody else's chest by being a shorter fighter, but he's literally leaning towards Charles Oliveira, making sure that it's harder for Charles Oliveira to land the hook. That's why he's literally coming inside. So this is where Ilia Topuria's head is at. When he makes the exchange with Charles Oliveira, his head literally comes forward to make it harder for Charles Oliveira to land those hooks, which is what Charles Oliveira was going for. He was going for a cross hook. We see here Charles Oliveira going for a cross hook, which doesn't land, and Ilia Topuria is able to land first. And that's all ego. That's an ego challenge. That is the definition of an ego challenge. I think that people are definitely overlooking the fact that Ilia Topuria is a very, very good positional fighter. And people are just overhyping the fact that he is a very, very powerful guy, which he is. But main thing first, Ilia Topuria is a smart, high IQ fighter, without a doubt. So while I think that those videos that people are making right now, that Ilia Topuria has a very, very strong kinetic change, while those videos are very, very interesting, I think that they are kind of superficial, and they are really, really kind of just a shallow explanation as to why Ilia Topuria is able to have really, really good 50-50 exchanges with his opponents.